1944. From a distance, they looked endless, rolling toward the horizon in waves of heat and dust. But up close, they told a quieter truth, that America's war effort didn't stop at the ocean. It stretched all the way to this soil, where the air smelled of diesel and hay, and where the battle lines were drawn between hunger and harvest. Most of the men were gone, fathers, brothers, uncles. Their names penciled into letters from Normandy or Anzio, their faces now reduced to fading photographs tacked above kitchen tables. What remained behind were women and children, carrying a nation's weight one field at a time. At dawn, a boy named Walter climbed onto a rusted tractor, the same one his father had left behind when he joined the 45th Infantry Division. Walter was 13, tall for his age, but the work had aged him faster. The machine coughed to life, belching smoke that hung low in the humid air. His little sister Annie, barely 10, sat on the fender beside him, clutching a bucket of water like a talisman. She was supposed to be in school, but the war had changed the meaning of childhood. Lessons were in the field now. How to guide the plow, how to patch a torn belt with twine, how to read clouds that threatened to undo a week's labor. All around them, the land was alive with movement. Girls swinging sickles, boys loading hay, their shadows stretching long and thin. Radio reports from Europe drifted through open barn doors. Allied landings in Normandy, bombers over France, Eisenhower's voice steady and grave. But here no one paused to listen for long. They couldn't afford to. Every stalk of wheat mattered. The War Food Administration had called it the Homefront harvest, and children across the Midwest had answered. Nearly 500,000 boys and girls, some as young as 12, were enlisted in the Victory Farm Volunteers, unpaid, untrained, but relentless. There was pride in it, yes, but also weariness. Nights came without comfort, hands burned from rope and sun, and eyes stung from dust storms that rolled in like ghosts from the Depression. Yet they worked, driven by a quiet, defiant rhythm, as if the steady hum of tractors was the sound of freedom itself. Even the elders in town who had once dismissed the young as fragile, now nodded with respect. "Those kids," said Mrs. Coleman, the postmistress, "they don't just grow wheat. They're growing a country." That morning began like any other, the whistle of the 610 freight train cutting through the valley, a signal that the world beyond the fields still existed. But today something different followed. A convoy of olive green trucks, each marked with a bold red stencil, PW, prisoner of war. Dust trailed behind them like smoke, and the engines roared past the schoolhouse, past the grain silo, past the cluster of curious children who stopped their work and shielded their eyes. In the back of one truck, through the mesh of metal, faces appeared, sunburnt, gaunt, and unmistakably foreign. German soldiers. And to everyone's surprise, among them were women. They wore gray Luftwaffe uniforms, their hair tucked beneath caps, their expressions stern but tired. They didn't look like monsters, as the posters in town had shown. They looked like people who had lost everything. The children stood silent as the convoy passed, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and fascination. One boy whispered, "Those are Nazis," and Annie, still clutching her bucket, asked in a voice barely above a breath, "But why are they women?" The truck slowed near the county fairgrounds, where the military had converted an old livestock enclosure into a temporary holding site. Wooden towers stood at the corners, manned by sleepy guards with rifles slung low. A banner that once advertised the Alva County Fair, pie contest and rodeo now hung faded and torn, repurposed for a different kind of order. The children watched as the prisoners were unloaded, some limping, some stoic, some glancing nervously toward the wide-open plains. They had come from another world, one where defeat was unthinkable. Now the war's geography had turned upside down. By noon, word had spread through town. The Germans were being sent to work details under military supervision to help with the harvest, part of a nationwide policy allowing POW labor in non-combat industries. For farmers, it was relief. For the children, it was confusion. To them, the enemy had always been distant, men in helmets, somewhere over there. But now the enemy had faces they could almost touch. Walter's mother, Ruth, called the children in for lunch, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly as she cut cornbread. "You'll see them up close soon enough," she said quietly. "They're not devils, but don't forget, their country's burned half the world." She paused, then added, "Be kind, but be careful." The phrase stayed with Walter like a commandment. That afternoon, as the sun burned low, the convoy returned, this time stopping at the fields. The guards stepped out, directing a few of the POWs to unload sacks of grain. Among them were two women who looked no older than Walter's mother. One of them, her face thin and sharp, caught sight of the children lifting hay bales and frowned. Her companion whispered something in German and both shook their heads in disbelief. Later, an interpreter explained. They couldn't understand how America sent its children to do men's work, but the children didn't see it that way. Walter wiped his brow and kept stacking, his muscles trembling but his jaw set. Annie dragged water buckets twice her size. They were scared, yes, of the guards' rifles, of the foreign voices, of the endless horizon that made them feel small. But fear had no place here. The land demanded courage. As the sun slipped below the fields, one of the German women, her name was Helga, though the children wouldn't know it yet, stood by the truck and watched. Her gaze lingered on Walter's cracked hands, on Annie's stubborn persistence, on the quiet discipline that reminded her painfully of home. For a moment she felt a strange stirring of respect when on something like guilt. The Reich had promised that its youth were the strongest on earth. Yet here, in the dust and fading light, she saw strength of another kind, untrained, unarmed, unyielding. When the convoy finally left, its tires cutting through gravel, the air seemed heavier somehow. Walter watched until the last truck vanished beyond the cottonwoods. Annie tugged his sleeve. "They looked scared too," she said softly. He didn't answer. He just stared down the dirt road, where the sun had painted the sky in blood-orange streaks. In the distance, faint and echoing, came the sound of a radio from the farmhouse. News of battles fought far away. But for the children of Oklahoma, the front lines had already reached them, in the form of strangers behind wire, and a harvest that waited for no man. And when the next morning came, the sound of engines returned. This time the guards weren't alone. The prisoners were stepping down again, sleeves rolled, eyes wary. Walter tightened his grip on the shovel, and Annie reached for his arm. The war, it seemed, had found its way to their doorstep, and neither of them yet knew how close it was about to get. The sun rose merciless and white, turning the camp's barbed wire into thin strands of fire. By mid-morning, the Oklahoma heat shimmered like a curtain, bending the world into wavering shapes, trucks, guards, watchtowers, shadows of men and women pacing behind fences that stretched across the old fairgrounds. The war was thousands of miles away, yet here it had left a visible scar, a patch of German gray in the middle of American gold. From the schoolhouse hill, the children could see the tops of the tents, the motion of prisoners like distant figures in a mirage. For Walter and Annie, the sight carried both fear and fascination. These were the enemies their father was fighting in Europe, and now they were only a few fields away. The camp was small but orderly, a mirror of the nation's efficiency. Inside, the prisoners worked quietly, divided by rank and role. The men hauled lumber, fixed fences, dug irrigation ditches. The women, members of the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps, performed clerical work, cooked or stitched torn uniforms. They had been captured after the Allied breakthrough in Normandy and shipped across the Atlantic in convoys that once carried wheat to Britain. Officially, they were non-combatants. Unofficially, they carried the same pride as any soldier who once believed in Hitler's victory. Helga Ritter, 31, had been a signals operator stationed near St. Lo before her capture. She had joined the Luftwaffe to see the world, but had seen only ruin. Now she found herself in the middle of America, a country she had been taught to imagine as weak, frivolous, and soft. Every morning she watched through the fence as American children drove tractors across the fields, their faces streaked with dirt and sunlight, their laughter rising above the whine of engines. It unsettled her. They let their children work. She muttered once in disbelief. Barbarians. Yet the longer she watched, the less sure she was of what barbarism meant. The U.S. Guards treated their prisoners with a mix of caution and indifference. They followed Geneva Convention rules, adequate food, medical care, pay in camp scrip. The Germans were required to labor 8 hours a day, paid 40 cents per hour for non-hazardous work. For many, it was a strange captivity, humane, organized, and almost peaceful. Letters from home arrived regularly, censored but intact, reminding them that Germany still stood, though barely. The camp commander, Captain Avery, was a quiet man who carried himself with the calm authority of someone too tired to hate. "We're not here to punish," he told his men. "We're here to prove what freedom looks like." Outside the wire, the children worked the same hours. Walter had been assigned to help load grain trucks for delivery to the rail depot, work that brought him close to the camp's edge. At first, he avoided looking at the prisoners. But one afternoon, as he hoisted a sack of corn, he caught Helga's gaze through the fence. She was standing beside a table folding laundry. Their eyes met for a moment too long, neither smiling nor turning away. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was recognition. The wordless understanding between two people trapped in duties larger than themselves. Later that day, when a storm threatened and the guards rushed to secure equipment, one of the younger German women, Erica, slipped near the fence, her shoe caught in mud. Walter hesitated before stepping forward, lifting the fallen crate that had pinned her foot. For a heartbeat, they stood only a few feet apart, divided by the wire. Erica murmured a thank you in broken English. He nodded and returned to his truck without a word. Helga watched from the distance, silent, her thoughts unsettled. Back in the barracks that night, she said softly, the boy could have ignored her. But he didn't. One of her comrades replied, "They only act decent for the guards." Helga said nothing. She wasn't sure that was true anymore. By late July, routine had set in. Prisoners worked in the mornings, locals in the afternoons. The war's progress was measured by rumors, whispers from new arrivals who spoke of Allied bombs turning Hamburg to ash, of Russian advances toward Warsaw. Some prisoners still believed Germany would rise again. Others stopped pretending. For Helga, each passing day beneath the Oklahoma sun felt like exile from a dying dream. She began sketching the camp in her notebook, capturing the endless fences, the alien horizon, the thin shadows of children who worked as if time itself were chasing them. She drew Walter once without realizing why. Annie, too young to understand politics, saw the prisoners as strange adults who rarely smiled. When her mother forbade her to wander near the camp, she obeyed, mostly. From the barn loft, she could sometimes hear German voices singing at night, soft and mournful, drifting over the plains. The sound didn't feel like the enemy. It felt like homesickness. One evening she told her brother, "They sound lonely." Walter didn't answer. He was thinking of their father somewhere in France. Maybe watching the same sun set over another field. Then, near the end of the month, the first incident happened. Small, but enough to change the rhythm of things. A guard found a section of wire slightly bent near the irrigation ditch. No one had escaped, but it sparked suspicion. The prisoners were counted twice a day after that. The guards grew stricter, the locals more wary. Captain Avery dismissed the panic. A coyote could have done it. But he assigned 2 men to patrol the perimeter anyway. The children noticed the tension immediately. Conversations grew quieter at supper. The radio played louder as if to fill the space that fear left behind. Helga felt it too. One morning, while stacking tools near the workshed, she overheard 2 male prisoners whispering about Der Zug, the train. She didn't know details, but she sensed danger. She told Erica, "They'll be fools if they try." Erica shrugged. They have to believe in something. But that night, Helga couldn't sleep. The memory of the children, their unflinching eyes, their calm under labor, impressed against her thoughts. She wondered what it meant that she, who once sent coded messages for war, now hesitated to protect those still fighting it. The next day, the heat broke suddenly, clouds gathering in thick folds over the plains, the smell of rain mixed with diesel and sweat. The POWs were sent to unload supply crates. The children helped with the same task on the other side of the fence. For the first time, both groups worked within shouting distance, divided only by a few yards of space and a strand of wire. Thunder rolled in the distance, but no one stopped. Helga's sleeves were rolled to her elbows. Walter's shirt clung to his back. At one point, as he lifted a heavy sack, it tore open, spilling corn onto the ground. Without thinking, she bent down to gather the fallen kernels through the fence. Their hands almost touched. It was the briefest of gestures, human, ordinary, and forbidden. But in that moment, something invisible shifted. The air seemed to hold its breath, the storm waiting to break. And that night, when the rain finally came, washing the dust clean from the wire, no one noticed the faint shapes moving beyond the southern fence line. The first stirrings of an escape that would test every bond the summer had built. Fog lay thick across the fields that morning, a low white tide that swallowed fences, barns, and even sound. The roosters crowed late, their calls muffled by the mist. It was a rare quiet, the kind that made the world feel half asleep. Yet beneath it, something was already in motion. In the distance, where the ground dipped toward the creek, a patch of wire sagged slightly, dew clinging to its edges. Beyond it, faint footprints pressed into the damp earth leading toward the cottonwoods. The escape had begun before the sun even rose. Walter didn't know it yet. He was already awake, standing in the yard, rubbing his arms against the chill. The storm from the night before had cooled the air but left everything slick. The tractor wouldn't start. Its spark plugs had flooded. Annie was still inside, helping their mother prepare breakfast for the hired hands who hadn't shown up. From the direction of the camp came the faint rumble of trucks, then silence again, the kind that doesn't feel natural. Walter frowned. Something in the air felt wrong, though he couldn't have said why. By 6 o'clock, the fog began to thin, and the outline of the camp sharpened like a photograph coming into focus. The guards were late making their rounds. Inside, prisoners moved in uneasy silence, some lingering near the fence, some pretending not to see what others were doing. Helga had felt the tension the moment she stepped from her tent. The men from Barrack 4, 3 of them, she realized now, were missing. Their cots lay empty, the blankets folded too neatly. She walked toward the kitchen tent, but the interpreter, a corporal named Hillman, was nowhere to be found. She turned to Erica, her voice low. "They did it. Last night." Erica's face went pale. "Fools, they'll never make it." Helga said nothing. Her mind flickered to the children in the fields, to the boy who had helped lift the crate, to the girl who watched everything with wide, steady eyes. The thought of those children made her stomach tighten. She had seen escape attempts before, in France and Belgium, and she knew how they ended. Always the same: search parties, gunfire, punishment. This time it would be Americans doing the shooting. She told herself she shouldn't care, but she did. Outside the fence, Walter was already in the fields checking the irrigation line. The fog was lifting in thin, torn veils. As he walked toward the ditch, something caught his eye. A scrap of fabric snagged on the barbed wire near the far edge of the camp. He stepped closer. It was gray cloth, the color of a Luftwaffe uniform. He followed the line of prints leading away from the fence, faint but clear in the damp soil. They headed straight toward the creek, then curved along the tree line. His pulse quickened. He looked toward the road. No guards in sight, just silence and the far-off whine of cicadas. He ran back toward the barn, shouting for his mother. Ruth came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. What is it? There's people out there, he said breathlessly. From the camp. They broke out, I think. Before she could answer, a military jeep came roaring down the dirt road, its tires spraying mud. 2 guards sat in front, rifles across their laps. One jumped out before it stopped moving. You seen anyone? He barked. Walter pointed toward the creek. The guard nodded, then called to his driver. Radio Captain Avery, we've got a trail. From the camp, alarms began to sound and a shrill whistle cutting through the fog. Prisoners froze mid-task. Helga turned her head toward the sound and saw the guards running, rifles slung, voices sharp. One pointed south, toward the same field where the children worked. She felt her breath catch. The foolish men hadn't gone far. At the fence, chaos stirred. The guards shouted in English. The prisoners murmured among themselves. A few of the women prayed softly, clutching their hands. Helga stood apart, her jaw set. She thought of saying nothing, of letting fate unfold. But as she watched the soldiers run toward the fields, the same direction the boy and his sister had gone, something inside her broke loose. She grabbed Erica's arm. Tell them. Tell the guard the men went east along the ditch, not south. Erica hesitated. They'll think you're helping them. I'm helping those children, Helga snapped. Then she called out, her voice ringing through the morning air. Ost, Sie sind nach Osten. The nearest guard turned, startled, and shouted back for translation. A sergeant nearby understood enough German to act. Within seconds, 2 trucks swerved eastward, toward the creek bend where the fugitives had vanished. Meanwhile, Walter reached the tractor at the far end of the field where Annie was waiting. Get down, he whispered. There's Germans out here. She stared at him wide-eyed. From the camp? He nodded. The sound of engines echoed closer. The fog was lifting fast now, sunlight striking through in golden shafts. Across the field, he saw a movement. 3 figures running low, hunched, their clothes dark with mud. One stumbled. Another yanked him up. They were maybe 100 yards away, heading for the rail line beyond the cottonwoods. Walter knew what the guards would do when they caught sight. Instinctively, he climbed onto the tractor. What are you doing? Annie cried. Blocking the road, he said. They can't go through the field. The guards will see him. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. He drove forward, steering the heavy machine across the narrow dirt road that led out of the fields, positioning it sideways like a barricade. Annie followed on foot, clutching his sleeve. Moments later, the first jeep appeared, skidding through the mud, guards shouting. Walter waved and pointed toward the trees. One soldier nodded sharply, then disappeared into the brush with his rifle raised. The sound of shouting followed. Short bursts in English and German overlapping like echoes. Helga, back at the fence, gripped the wire so tightly it cut into her palms. She couldn't see the chase, only the rising smoke from the jeep's exhaust. Around her, the other prisoners stood silent, caught between guilt and awe. They're just boys, one muttered. Helga closed her eyes. So were we once, she said. The shots came soon after, not many, just 2. Then quiet. The sound carried across the plains over the wheat and the barbed wire, settling like dust. Walter froze where he stood, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Annie pressed her face into his sleeve. Neither spoke. When the guards returned half an hour later, their expressions were grim but composed. The escapees had been found unhurt, exhausted, half-starved, hiding near the creek. They surrendered, one of the soldiers said simply. No one's dead. Relief washed through the air like the cool breath after rain. Walter exhaled shakily, feeling for the first time how young he still was. At the camp, Captain Avery recorded the incident in his report. Attempted escape, 3 German POWs. Prevented by timely observation of local youth laborers. The official language flattened the event into a line of ink. But for those who lived it, the morning would never feel ordinary again. That evening, as the sun bled out over the horizon, the guards escorted the recaptured men back through the gates. The prisoners watched in silence. Helga stood at the front, her eyes fixed not on the men but on the children beyond the fence. On Walter, who stood straight despite his shaking hands, and on Annie, who looked at her not with fear, but with something gentler. Helga's throat tightened. For the first time she felt the weight of a truth that the Reich had never taught her. Strength was not born of obedience, but of mercy. When darkness fell, she sat alone on her bunk, the air still heavy with the smell of gunpowder and wet grass. Somewhere outside, a child's laughter drifted faintly through the wire. It wasn't mocking. It was alive and unbroken, and that, she thought, was what truly frightened her. The heat returned with vengeance the next morning, flattening everything beneath its glare. The storm and fog of the escape had left behind a strange calm, the kind that felt earned, not given. The guards moved slower now, their tempers cooled by relief. The prisoners worked quietly, perhaps understanding they had tested the limits of mercy and survived it. Even the air inside the wire seemed to hum differently, as if something invisible had shifted between captor and captive. Across the field, the children labored again, though the laughter that usually filled their hours had quieted into concentration. War had taught them, too, that courage could look like silence. Walter carried himself differently that day. He had seen things he could not explain, not to his mother or even to Annie. The sound of those 2 gunshots still echoed somewhere behind his ribs. But there was pride mixed in with the fear. He had done what needed doing, not because anyone told him to, but because it was right. At 13, he didn't yet have words for the feeling. He only knew that something about the world had changed shape. When he looked toward the camp, he no longer saw the wire first. He saw faces. Helga worked near the perimeter, sorting grain with a few of the women assigned to light duty. Her uniform had faded from gray to almost blue under the sun. When she saw Walter hauling water barrels along the fence line, she hesitated, then raised her hand slightly. Not a wave, but something smaller, more tentative, an acknowledgement. He looked up, caught off guard, then nodded once before continuing. The gesture was brief, but enough to draw a quiet smile from her. The world was still divided, but for the first time it felt possible to imagine a bridge. That afternoon, Captain Avery gathered his men and addressed the camp. The escapees, he said, would be confined separately but treated humanely. There would be no reprisals. His voice carried the measured weight of a man who understood victory could be moral as well as military. "We win," he said, "by staying who we are." Helga listened from a distance, the words sinking deeper than she expected. Back home, commands had always come with slogans and shouting. Here they came soft but unbending. It unsettled her more than any threat could have. Work resumed under the watchful sun. A supply wagon broke an axle near the fence, spilling sacks of seed into the dirt. Walter, passing by, stopped to help the guards lift it. Without waiting for permission, Helga knelt on the other side of the wire, scooping the scattered kernels back into the torn sack. For a moment, the scene looked almost absurd. Two enemies knee-deep in grain, working side by side like neighbors at harvest. A guard started to bark at her to step away, but stopped, realizing how harmless, even natural, it seemed. The boy and the woman worked wordlessly until the last of the seed was gathered. When they finished, Helga brushed her palms and said softly, "Strong." Walter blinked, unsure if she meant him or the act itself. He muttered, "We have to be." She nodded as though that explained everything. By evening, the air turned honey-colored, thick with dust and the smell of cut hay. Annie sat on the porch steps humming an old church tune, watching the smoke from the camp kitchen drift into the sky. Her mother joined her, folding laundry that had dried stiff in the sun. "They're not what I expected," Annie said quietly. Ruth looked toward the camp, her expression unreadable. "War makes everyone something they're not," she said. "Some meaner, some kinder." Then she touched her daughter's shoulder. "Best thing we can do is stay decent. That's what wins in the end." Inside the camp, Helga and the other women gathered near the wash basins, the air heavy with the scent of soap and iron. Erica handed her a small scrap of paper, a torn piece from an old ledger, on which she had written a few English words learned from overheard conversations. "Bread, son, thank you." Helga smiled faintly. "You plan to thank the guards?" she teased. Erica shrugged. "Maybe the children." Helga tucked the scrap into her pocket, as though the words themselves were seeds to be planted somewhere safer. The next few days passed in uneasy peace. The prisoners worked under supervision, mending fences, helping stack grain. The townspeople grew used to their presence. A strange rhythm developed. Mornings of labor, afternoons of wary observation, evenings of exhausted stillness. And within that rhythm, something like understanding began to take root. When the guards weren't looking, Annie would leave small things near the fence. An apple, a bit of fabric, once even a folded page from a church hymnal. The German women never spoke of it aloud, but by morning the gifts always disappeared. One day, Helga left something in return. A small carved button made from wood, shaped into a flower. Annie found it beneath the fence post at sunrise, the dew still fresh on it. She hid it in her apron pocket, her heart fluttering with a strange warmth she didn't yet understand. Then, in early August, a truck arrived carrying Red Cross parcels, chocolate bars, canned milk, cigarettes, luxuries for people who had forgotten the word. Captain Avery distributed them fairly, even to the prisoners. That evening, as the camp quieted, Helga broke a chocolate square in half and handed it through the fence to Walter, who had come to fetch the water trough left nearby. He froze, unsure if it was a trick. She gave a slight nod, her expression almost maternal. "For your sister," she said in halting English. He hesitated, then took it. It was the first chocolate they'd seen in months. Later that night, Ruth found the wrapper on the table and frowned. "Where did you get this?" Walter hesitated, then answered, "From the camp." She stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You tell no one. Some folks wouldn't understand kindness right now." He nodded, but part of him wanted to tell everyone, to shout that not every enemy stayed an enemy forever. As August stretched on, word came from Europe. Paris had been liberated. The war, they said, might be over soon. The prisoners received the news with a strange quiet. Some wept. Others stared into the distance as if trying to picture home after so much distance. Helga sat outside her tent, watching the sky burn red with sunset. "It ends," Erica whispered. Helga shook her head. "No, it changes." That evening, the children returned from the fields, their overalls caked with dust, their faces streaked with light. Helga watched them, hands resting on the fence. "They have nothing to prove," she murmured in German. And yet they carry the world. The other women nodded, though none replied. The next morning, when the trucks came to transfer half the camp north to Kansas, Helga was among those chosen. As she climbed aboard, she turned once more toward the field. Walter and Annie were there, standing by the tractor, waving hesitantly. Helga raised her hand in return, a final salute not of armies but of endurance. As the convoy rumbled away, the children stood in the dust until the last truck disappeared. The air felt strangely empty without the wire's presence, without the watchtowers and voices. Annie held the wooden flower in her palm. "Think they'll remember us?" she asked. Walter looked toward the horizon, where the sun rose over a land that had known no bombs, no occupation, only hard work and hope.